Hello everyone, this is Poohead189, and today we're going to be talking about something kind of niche. You see, people often ask me to make videos on One Piece or Naruto or Jujutsu Kaisen, and I tell them I either haven't watched them all or have only watched them casually. I'm just not qualified to give information or speculation videos on these things. Maybe someday, but definitely not now. I'll only really talk about something and make a video providing information if it's something I've hammered out quite a bit. Dragon Ball, for instance, even past how long I've been a fan, I've watched the anime and read the manga numerous times. I've talked about it with other superfans almost daily for over 15 years. I've debated, met voice actors. I know my stuff. And there's only a handful of other anime or topics I can say I know about as well. Yu Yu Hakusho, for instance, is one of them. I've written professionally. I'm a good writer. I can talk about writing. But another passion of mine, and the focus of my schooling, is history, particularly the medieval era and antiquity, which is pre-medieval, essentially. That is my academic specialty, and so I am qualified enough to speak today on this odd topic of whether the Saiyans of Dragon Ball and the Spartans in our history really have anything in common, and spoiler alert, they don't. Now, before we start, I was initially hesitant to make this video because it seems like a video someone would make if they ran out of video ideas, but since I am a historian, I thought it might be interesting to talk about. And for the purposes of this video, we will be talking about Sparta during the classical period, which is roughly around 490 BC to 404 BC. Though granted, there's an argument to be made we can go to 370 BC to the Battle of Leuctra, or the Third Sacred War in 356 BC, with the rise of Philip II of Macedonia, father to Alexander the Great. Anyway, we'll be talking about Sparta during its heyday, essentially, and if it has any similarities with the Saiyans. Now, I really have no idea where the claim comes from of Saiyans being called Space Spartans, other than the fact the Spartans are considered good fighters, and so are the Saiyans. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, the Saiyans were nominally tribal before the introduction of King Cold and Frieza, and eventually they formed a monarchy. Toriyama does say that they did have some limited technology, but while they had that and a king of the planet, obviously Vegeta's line, they very likely did not have a cohesive military, and their supposed disputes and wars with the Tuffles had little to do with tactics and more to do with raids, before culminating in a full moon that allowed them to wipe the Tuffles out. Hell, even if we go with the super lore of planet Sadala being destroyed, the mere fact it was destroyed showed the Saiyans' primitive barbarity, and their inclusion in the series only further showcases they fight more by instinct and natural aggression than any real martial ethos. The Saiyans are aliens, first and foremost. They do not have the same biological needs and desires that humans do. It's not because of some obligation to a state or even their sovereign. They did listen to their king, or they do listen to their king, depending on when you're talking about Dragon Ball, but only because of their caste system and because he was strong. Before and after Frieza's arrival, the Saiyans' main tactics were raids and quick conquests. At best, they had squad tactics, but they did not coordinate well in groups. Saiyans tend to enjoy single combat, and they're much like attack dogs. Just sick them on a certain person or place, and they will blow them up, likely quite messily, even if they are very efficient at it. Now, first thing you need to know about the Spartans, and this is important even if you've read Herodotus or Thucydides or Xenophon and the March of the 10,000, is that what we know about Sparta is mostly up for debate. The reason is because the Spartans, throughout their history, conducted a sort of misinformation campaign. They spread rumors about themselves so that potential enemies were intimidated or could not find out what was true. You'll hear a lot of outlandish claims on the Spartans, like how most Spartans were pedophiles, or how they slew babies, or how they were all gay, or how they were a huge slave state. One time, when an important visitor arrived, I forgot who it was, but the Spartans all pretended to eat this sort of strange gruel that made the visitor wonder just how the Spartans could maintain such great physiques if they ate nothing but this weird paste. Now, that's not to say we know nothing about Sparta. But even the sources can't always be trusted, and there have been various hacks that have tried to besmirch the Spartans' legacy in order to go against the far right trying to adopt the Spartans to fit their ideology. Hacks like Mike Cole, who allegedly is also a sexual predator too, who wrote the book called The Bronze Lie. I shouldn't get into it, but Spartan history is hard to pin down, and people will try and use them to fit their ideology, which is something I really hate. I always hate it when someone tries to use historical topics to promote or denounce modern politics, like Americans with the Civil War or the Crusades with being pro-white or anti-immigrant, and it's the same with the Spartans. I'll stop, but the point is, Sparta is difficult to know for certain, because they made sure to be confusing to harm their enemies, or even their potential enemies. And as for the Saiyans' barbarity and their life of raiding and conquering, this is nothing like the Spartans. The Spartans were not conquerors or raiders. They were the population of a hegemonic city-state in classical Greece, who did not idolize warriors. They idolized civic duty, which included their civic duty as soldiers. They needed a good military in order to protect their way of life, and to both protect their allies and their power. However, it is true that the Spartans were the most effective military on land, maybe even in the known world, during their heyday at least. But they did not do it because of savagery. They did it to protect their constitution, and because they did wish to please Ares above the other gods, even if they respected all of the gods. You see, the Spartans took religion extremely seriously and personally. The Saiyans, as far as we know, are areligious. The Spartans took their civic duty above all else. The Saiyans did not. They really only cared about fighting. The Saiyans are ruled by a king and a very small elite noble class. In fact, Toriyama says there's just 10 of them. The Spartans did not have such a society. They had 2 kings, the Agiad and the Eurypontid kings. I also should say that Spartan kings were not like monarchs in the way we think. The Saiyans, ironically, had a traditional king. The Spartan kings were simultaneously high priests and supreme military commanders with absolute military power. They held religious ceremonies, led religious rites, and were the top authority in terms of military campaigns. However, the government was more egalitarian. There was a council of elders, called the Gerousia, made up of 28 Spartans over 60 years old, and both kings, to make a council of 30. They decided policy, and then when they made policy, all Spartan men over 30 in a general assembly could vote on it. The Saiyans did not practice voting. The Spartans, though the slave state thing is vastly overblown, did have slaves like every other Greek city-state and most states or civilizations in general during that era. The Saiyans did not, though it's not out of any moral objections. They just preferred to kill to get their food, and when they joined Frieza's empire, they were given everything they needed anyway, so they didn't really need slaves. As I said, the Saiyan military was, at its most complex, based on squad tactics. Spartans had a far more complex military structure and hierarchy. In fact, the reason the Spartans were so effective was their cohesion, their ability to receive orders, and their complete belief in the city-state. Saiyans really only believed in their own strength. And as I mentioned previously, the Saiyans were warriors, while the Spartans were soldiers. Though I can say that the Spartans could be great warriors when they felt like it, but that's not what they really did unless severely pushed. Herodotus does tell us that during the fighting at Thermopylae with the 300 Spartans, after their cohesion broke with hours and hours of fighting, the Spartans began killing the Persians with their swords. Now, this is extremely impressive, considering that as far as we can tell, there was no formal training with the sword like the spear. A sword was a secondary, even tertiary weapon in classical Greece, something used only when one was at their most desperate, or when they were trying to fight a fleeing enemy. The spear was the main weapon, for its reach and ease of use, and how cheap it is to make. However, even when the military structure broke down after days of fighting on the field, the Spartans still butchered the Persians with weapons they never thought they would ever need to use. It would be like fighting multiple gunmen with a knife and winning. However, again, this was not because the Spartans loved fighting for fighting's sake. They fought for their city-state and their gods. The only real similarity between the Spartans and the Saiyans is that they fight real good. I mean, otherwise they're nothing really alike. If you want my opinion on a good parallel to the Saiyans, then I would say the Scandinavians and Vikings of the early medieval period would fit them far better. They traveled far and wide like the Saiyans in their pods to rape, pillage, and plunder, and even though the Vikings did have more military cohesion, they also prided themselves on close combat and duels, in a fashion at least. They had a lot of, in Iceland, they had quite a lot of feuds, and they did value single combat between each other. The Scandinavians also tended to eat more meat than the average European, because in Scandinavia, it was easier to raise cattle than to farm fruits and vegetables due to the climate, which gave them a surplus of protein and made them larger and stronger than the southerners they raided. And of course, we have the legendary berserkers, which lost all sense of themselves and flew into battle with a Saiyan-like savagery. It's almost kind of like going Ozaru. Also, the Scandinavian Viking raiders acted much like Saiyans working under Frieza because they too could be hired out as mercenaries from an entity with vast amounts of money to unleash upon their enemies. Although I will say that for about 40 or 50 years, the Spartans could also be utilized in such a fashion. Xenophon and the March of the 10,000, or like what he writes in the Anabasis, that actually happened because the Spartans, or at least a large group of Spartans, was hired by the Persians to help them fight in the civil war as mercenaries. And then when their paymaster got killed, Xenophon, along with these 10,000, a lot of them Spartans, had to march across Persia and back to Greece, which is what the story is about. So yes, Spartans could be hired as mercenaries, but they were loyal only to their city-state, really, whereas if you paid a Viking enough, he wouldn't care who his king was. He would be loyal to you as long as you kept giving him stuff. I can also say the Maori warriors might have been somewhat more Saiyan-like, and we can also simply say that the Saiyan caste system was made to be like feudal Japan during the Shogun era. Anyway, to the surprise of no one. And even past the government structure, the samurai did value single combat like the Saiyans. There's instances of when the Mongols invaded Tsushima in the late 13th century, when the Mongols were confused and surprised that individual samurai would try and goad them into single combat so they could take their heads. Plus, the Frieza Force armor nominally looks somewhat like the Gosuke armor of the 16th and 17th centuries in Japan, with their shoulder pauldrons, the torso protection, with only a small amount of protection below the waist in certain strips of lamellar armor. But yeah, that being said, let's just say you can make simple allusions and comparisons to Saiyans and various peoples in the world, but the Spartans are likely the least similar to the Saiyans when it comes to militarized civilizations. They are far more like space Vikings and Scandinavians or space samurai than space Spartans. Okay, thanks so much everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video or found this interesting somewhat. Please like, share, and subscribe if you wish to. I would appreciate it if you would click the bell icon, and if you feel like it, you can donate to the Patreon and follow me on Twitch. Hope you guys have a great day. Alright, see ya!